When I read that the theme of this section was titled Delivering Real Data and AI Projects, my first thought was, how do I even choose a place to begin with that? Because aren't all projects real projects? I'm sure many of you watching love experimenting with technology. If you're anything like me, you've got more than your fair share of in-progress data and AI projects. And these are as real as anything else. I don't think many people have trouble doing real projects because we do them all the time. But the issue I often see when I'm working with different organisations is doing the right projects. Because while more organisations are investing in data and AI, there's a high percentage who are still not experiencing real value. According to Boston Consulting Group, only 1 in 10 companies who invest in an AI strategy actually see any significant financial return. So why is that? What is it about data and AI that has got so many of us in the habit of doing the wrong project? Before I get into it then, who am I? So my name is Patrick Murray. I'm Head of Data Analytics and AI at Razor. And one of the things that we really love to do at Razor is help organisations find that right solution or that right technology that helps move them forward. And in my role at Razor, I'm lucky to get to work with companies of all shapes and sizes. And one thing I've noticed over my career is that the shape and size of companies who are exploring data and AI is starting to change. It's moved beyond just being a tool for industries like finance and retail. I've actually worked with charities who are exploring AI as a way to improve their services. I've even seen a stairlift company make use of computer vision in order to improve the way they do business. Now, if that tells us anything, it's that we've moved beyond the early adopters, and the rest of that majority are starting to take note of what data and AI can do for them. And that distinction between early adopters and the early majority is significant. Now, the good news is that this move is partially being driven by how accessible this technology is becoming. Because it doesn't cost the earth to get started, and you don't really need to be an expert to start exploring what's possible. But is that enough to keep it around? Now, you might have heard of this jump between early adopters and this majority, described as a chasm. And it's a chasm because it's something that any product or service, particularly in technology, needs to overcome if it's going to build a long-term staying power. Now, this chasm occurs because of the gulf between the attitudes and the priorities of organisations in these two different market segments. Where an early adopter might be able to tolerate some of the, let's say, turbulence that comes along with adopting a brand new technology, companies in that majority, they need some guarantee of that success because it needs to support their ambitions of that slow and steady progress. Now, organisations in this segment, they're still keen to explore, but it needs to be backed up by that clear and demonstrable impact. Now, when we're working on our own pet projects, we can spend as much time as we need making mistakes. But in a world of deadlines, budgets, and other various projects competing for our attention, impatience can quickly set in, and this is what derails data projects if that value isn't felt early. So something I'll talk about a little bit later on. Now, one thing I'm sure we can all agree that data and AI hasn't been short of on the last decade is hype. And hype is great for galvanising early adopters, but as technologists and data professionals, we're the ones who need to back up that hype with tangible value. If we continue to think and talk about AI exclusively in terms of the next big breakthrough, we risk losing that majority who are valuing that slow and steady process improvements over just these massive breakthroughs. And that doesn't mean you can't be innovative, and the bleeding edge of data and AI is just as important now as it's ever been. But to me, it's just as important and just as exciting to figure out how we can democratise this technology. How can we apply it to challenges that are being faced right now by organisations, whether they're manufacturers, whether they're charities, or apparently stairlift companies? And frankly, in my experience, a lot of these organisations, they're just not ready to overhaul everything they do so they can adopt the latest AI technology. And to be honest, they often don't really need to either. They might just not be set up for it, or They don't know what data they do have. Without having those basics in place first, it's no wonder a lot of these massive transformation projects start to fail. It's time we move past this hype by changing our approach to these projects to focus on what's actually needed rather than what we just think is needed. So what is needed? What is the missing piece that's caused so many of us to embark on the wrong projects? Now, let's face it, there's 1,000 different ways that a project can go wrong. But in my experience, there's one common and, in my opinion, pretty preventable root cause that links the kind of things I've talked about so far. And that is a failure to maintain a focus on value. Now, that might sound really obvious, because why else would we embark on a project other than to deliver some kind of value at the end of it? And while it sounds obvious, if that value isn't sat at the forefront of your mind, it can just get lost like anything else in all the other noises that accompany a project. It's really easy to get tunnel vision onto something that it feels like you should be doing, whether that's writing code or deploying a new pipeline. What happens in this instance is projects start to meander. You start to lose sight of why you started in the first place, and it can be months and months of what feels like productive work, but then it's suddenly stopped by someone asking, hang on, why are we doing this again? Now, meandering is what I do best on pet projects. I love the freedom to wander and experiment with different models and data sets. But when we're dealing with these pesky projects that have issues like timelines and budgets, then it becomes a problem. Now, there are a few ways that this can manifest itself. One of them is simply building the wrong thing or solving a problem that doesn't exist. Now, hopefully, I don't need to explain why that's an issue. But something that is just as disruptive, and what I find is a lot more likely to sneak up on you, is doing the wrong bits of the right solution. Now, this is an issue that can lead to a phenomenon which you might have heard of, but is known as the trough of disillusionment. The trough of disillusionment is that stage of a project where the initial enthusiasm has gone. It's that moment you're sitting around the table with the CEO and you're explaining that, no, really, this database is going to change everything. But when it comes to actually showing some tangible value, it's just not there yet. And it's that moment the project stutters, before eventually grinding to a halt because it needs more money or the next project's come along. At this point, it doesn't matter whether the solution you came up with was the right one or the wrong one from a technical sense. When you're delivering a project in this kind of environment, it's this trough that will prevent you from finding out whether you were right or wrong. Now, one of the reasons that this happens, possibly more often in data and AI projects, is simply that data is really, really overrated. Unless you can turn it into a useful insight, it's just an overhead, and it's an overhead you have to pay to store. It's an overhead you have to pay to look after. So it's not really a surprise that a lot of our organisations just don't bother to do this on a meaningful scale. On top of that, if you don't, or if you can't take action on the data that you do have, it's just more noise, and let's face it, the world is already noisy enough. That actionable insight is the value that you need to focus on. You should be obsessed with it. It doesn't matter whether the action is taken by a human, it doesn't matter if it's a computer. Turning data from overhead into insight is the essence of just about any data project. Now, a great illustration of this is a concept known as the Dikw Pyramid. Now, Dikw stands for data, information, knowledge, wisdom. And this represents the stages through which data needs to pass in order to deliver that value. The levels get narrower and narrower as we go, as we combine and curate our data into that useful stuff. Now, I said it was overrated, but underpinning everything is data. But if we take an everyday example of data, red light, this is pretty much meaningless, and there isn't really a single conclusion we can draw here. But if we add some meaning, we can turn it into information. The traffic light on Sydney Street has turned red. Now we're starting to understand what that red light means, which is very nice. But so what? We turn it into knowledge by adding some context. I am driving on Sydney Street, and the traffic light on Sydney Street has turned red. This little bit of context has turned that meaningless data point into something that we understand about our situation. The final step then is to turn that into some action. I'd better stop the car. Now that's a pretty generic everyday example, but it captures the fundamental goal of just about any data project, which is to turn data into the wisdom that we can use to take action. In a business setting, this could be just giving a piece of data the right context by linking it to a traditionally secondary siloed data set. You might take that context and just put it in the right person's hands with the right data pipeline or a well-designed dashboard. Most importantly of all though, it's also about empowering people to take action with that wisdom once they have it. Now, I've got a couple of issues with this pyramid. First of all, and to be honest, the thing most relevant to a lot of the data projects that I've seen is there isn't actually a traffic light on Sydney Street. Secondly though, the implication of this pyramid is that you have to build your foundation first, which is that overrated data. And it's this misconception that gets organisations to fall in the trough. They focus all their effort on this data layer right at the start. They might think, hey, we've got loads of data, let's make it all available, because that's the goal of data transformation, right? Now this can cause problems for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's usually an enormous undertaking with data spread from the cloud to macro-ridden spreadsheets and just about everywhere in between. It's very, very difficult to realistically plan all that from beginning to end. But secondly, and probably most importantly, there is usually very, very little tangible value that comes along with focusing on that layer. At this point, you might learn that you've got lots of lights, but so what? You need to find out very, very quickly if they mean you should stop, go, or if you need to change direction altogether. If you don't do that, momentum stops because there's no quick impact and people's behaviours all just stay the same. And it's at that point that we risk losing that majority. There are too many stories of companies who have invested in data and digital technology, but as far as they're concerned, they've got nothing to show for it. So where do you start if it's not building the foundation? The answer is simple. Start small, start focused, and start from the top. Instead of starting from the bottom and looking for something to do with the data, reframe your approach to starting from that actionable piece of insight that you want in someone's hands and then work backwards. Find that small slice from top to bottom and then make that the basis of your solution. Even just structuring your discussions with your teams on this top level instead of at the bottom turns conversations about data into ones about values, problems, and opportunities. Finding that right solution, that right slice, isn't easy. And more often than not, there's not one single option that's right. But in my experience, just framing your early conversations this way, it's a lot more productive than just starting at that and digging into that data layer at the bottom. So rather than talking about the data you have, talk about the questions you want to answer. If the data was a person standing in a room with you, what would you be asking them? Think in terms of really specific situations and specific decisions rather than just hypotheticals. Because building data solutions for problems that don't really exist will only muddy the water and it'll only slow you down. Now, what I really don't want you to leave this talk with is the idea that there's no place for AI or exciting novel solutions, because to be honest, it's the opposite. AI can and should be used as a tool to support work at any of these levels, whether it's using natural language processing to enrich a data set you've already got. You can utilize computer vision to capture a new data set entirely, or use anomaly detection to inform the right person that they need to take action. Because the approach isn't about doing things the old-fashioned way. It's just about ensuring that whatever solution you do choose to develop is being directed at the right thing in the right way. In fact, one of the great benefits about that commoditization of AI technology is the ability to leverage these off-the-shelf tools that will get you started. Think in terms of 80-20 principles. Is there an off-the-shelf AI solution that can just help you get off the ground quickly? Because these solutions, they're not always optimal, but in the early stages of a project, an imperfect, pre-trained image recognition model is a lot better at demonstrating your key principles than the perfect model that just never gets to see the light of day. We've reached a critical moment in the development of data and AI technology. While that boundary continues to be pushed, it's our responsibility to make sure that everyone else is brought along as well. We know this stuff can help all kinds of organisations, but we need to start putting our money where our mouth is if that majority is ever going to feel the benefit. So if you're going to take one thing away from this talk, make it an obsession with value. Yes, all projects are real, but by starting small, starting focused, and starting with the value at the end, you can make sure that your real projects are also the right ones.